In the now playing documental, we are going to show you what those Renaissance and Reformation is in a basically is that start during the Middle Age. The Renaissance was a fervent period of European culture, artistic, political, and economic following during the Middle Age, generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century. The Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art. Some of the greatest thinkers, authors, statesmen, scientists, and artists in human history thrived during this era, while global exploration opened up new lands and culture to European commerce. The Renaissance is credited with bridging the gap between the Middle Age and modern-day civilization. During the 14th century, a cultural movement called Humanism began to gain momentum in Italy. Among its many principles, humanism promoted the idea that man was a center of his own universe, and people should embrace human achievement in education, classical art, literature, and science.
What was the Reformation? The Reformation is a schism that divided the Roman Catholic Church and the only unity of Christendom. The origins of the Reformation were in an attempt to reform the Church. There had been many attempts in the past to reform the Church, but they had all failed. By the early 16th century, there was a growing crescendo of call for the reform of the Church and an end to the immorality and corruption of the clergy. The Reformation was not an attempt to divide the Roman Catholic Church, but it was an effort to reform it. The failure of the Catholic Church to reform and its attempt to suppress the reformers meant that it drove many to establish their own church. The Reformation was an attempt to return to the original teachings and values of the early or apostolic church. The reformers claimed that only the Bible could be taught and instruct men about the Word of God, and had little regard for the received wisdom and authority. Essentially, the only text that mattered was the Bible, and anything that was not in the Bible should be rejected. The Reformation placed more emphasis on the individual and in the word of Luther. People could not be saved by good works or sacrament, but by faith alone. Ultimately, the interpretation meant that the reformers reject much of the traditional teachings of the Church and result in a theological dispute between the reformers and the Church, especially in Germany. This dispute led to a full-blown schism in the Catholic Church and the reformation of separate Protestant churches. The causes of the Reformation were manifold, but the Renaissance and the Humanism movement were crucial and in that decisive.
How did the Renaissance influence the Reformation? Did the Renaissance lead the Protestant Reformation? Without the Renaissance, it is difficult to imagine the Protestant Reformation could have succeeded in Europe. The Renaissance placed the human beings at the center of life and had shown that this world was just not a vale of tears, but was something that could be meaningful, and it has possible for people to live without reference to divine. The Renaissance and rebirth was influenced by the ideas of the ancient past, and it drew from Roman and Greek civilization in order to provide a solution to current problems. The Renaissance was a pan-European phenomenon and changed the mental worldwide of view elite in Europe, and it needed the emergent middle class across the continent. The cultural movement has to have a profound impression of peoples worldwide. The Renaissance produced the humanists, who were a movement of educators and scholars. They sought truth and knowledge by re-examining classical texts and the Bible. The humanist ideas in growth textual analysis and the Northern Renaissance is such as the intellectual landscape, and that encouraged many church reformers such as Martin Luther, and they later broke with Rome and divided Europe into confessional camps, Protestantism and Catholicism. Thank you, and it was the Reformation and the Renaissance, made by Jason, Ellen, and Giselle.